Thank you very much. If you were just to listen to the techno-optimists, you would think that we are on a highway to heaven on earth and the self-driving buses are all speeding up at an exponential pace. On the other hand, if you just listen to the techno-pessimists, we are clearly going straight to hell in a handbasket. But most of us here, I would gather, perceive technology as a source of both promise and productivity. And yet there is a considerable degree of disquiet about specific technologies, and disquiet about the overall trajectory of scientific discovery and technological innovation. And you see that disquiet in all kinds of areas. The basic norm that we do not tinker with the human genome. Or in Europe here, you have your debate over the acceptability of genetically modified foods. In the US, we had a debate over the acceptability of experimenting with embryonic stem cells. And then there are ongoing issues around cybersecurity, infosecurity, and the toxicity of nanoparticles. Perhaps the self-driving car gives us a good metaphor for what we're dealing with. Technology is moving into the driver's seat as the primary determinant of humanity's destiny. And there is even the rather melodramatic possibility that we have begun inventing the human species as we know it out of existence. Now, when it comes to some of these more futuristic scenarios, designer babies and superintelligence, I'm your friendly skeptic. I'm friendly to the can-do engineering spirit that says remarkable things lie in our future. I'm deeply skeptical that we have the science or even often know what we're talking about when we talk about totally redesigning humans, or when we talk about computer systems that are smarter than humans in all respects. I don't think we know enough about intelligence to know whether this is even possible. And I don't even think we have the science at this time to know whether we can affect such change. Nevertheless, when it comes to 50, 100, 150 years down the road, I'm agnostic on what's possible. We did not know what we would be living through today at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're at really far down the road, and some pretty remarkable things will take place. But I do have a lot of near-term concerns, really a vast array of near-term concerns. But in the few minutes that I have to talk with you, I'm only going to be able to touch on three areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about autonomous systems. I'm going to talk about technological unemployment. And then I'm going to finish up with some technologies where we alter natural systems, where we alter the environment. And to conclude, I will have some comments for you about ways in which we can mitigate the risks and undesirable societal consequences. So let's begin with autonomous systems. Autonomous systems, there's a vast array of them, from self-driving cars to service robots in the home. I want to begin with talking about lethal autonomous weapons. So lethal autonomous weapons refers to weapon systems that can pick their own target and kill with little or no human intervention. As came up, as came up in one of our questions this morning, there has been the 5th year of meeting under the auspices of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the UN in Geneva. That was just concluded this past week. And that's really been to consider whether there should be a treaty banning the use of lethal autonomous weapons. Now, when many people think of lethal autonomous weapons, they think about something such as a drone that you see up here that has facial recognition software and waits till the right person shows up and then dispatches them. Or perhaps they think about robots replacing soldiers on the battlefield. But lethal autonomy is not a weapon system. It's a feature set that can be added to any weapon system. So imagine that you could have a lethal autonomous submarine carrying nuclear weapons, or a lethal autonomous weapon that launched high-powered munitions of some other sort. That should make it clear enough to you that we need to at least restrict some uses of these technologies. Now, I have recommended that to begin with, we put in place a new higher level norm. And my suggestion for that norm is that machines, even intelligent machines, do not make life and death decisions about humans. And at least with that, we can make it clear what's unacceptable. But then we will still have to deal with that vast middle range of applications where the deployment of a machine is really the extension of the will of and the intention of a commander. So this is not going to be easy to work through. And furthermore, its focus has moved away from an attempt to define autonomy or ban all systems and more on who has the responsibility if the system fails. So who has clear, meaningful oversight? The term is meaningful human control. And that's largely what they have been trying to define at the UN, and it's what they will be voting on. But what I want to underscore here is that lethal autonomous weapons, they are merely the tip of the iceberg. And that tip of that iceberg also includes self-driving cars. The difficulty is that all autonomous systems threaten to undermine the foundational principle that there is a human agent, either individual or corporate, that is responsible and potentially culpable and liable for that system should it fail. And the difficulty with autonomous systems, particularly ones that have learning capabilities, is no one knows what they're going to do in many situations. And that's actually true of even non-learning systems. They are complex, adaptive systems, and we don't know how they will act in unanticipated circumstances. So with lethal autonomous weapons, you have the possibility that the weapon could start a totally new conflict without anybody ever intending to do so, or escalating an existing conflict. So these are among the reasons that we need to begin to talk about restricting the use of some of these weapon systems. Now, to be sure, it's going to be difficult because there's also clear moral benefits to such systems. A lethal autonomous weapon system, for example, is a way of ensuring that there will be less human deaths during warfare. And that's become pretty important as we in the civilized world have become very sensitive to how many of our soldiers we lose. So again, this is not going to be an easy debate, but I think we are nuts if we go down this road of having lethal autonomous weapons, and I do not think humanity wants to go down the road of deleting responsibility for technologies we deploy. That's a pretty dangerous road for us to traverse. Technological unemployment. Now, technological unemployment is a term that was first coined by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, and he coined that in a 1930 paper to represent the long-standing Luddite fear that each new technology would rob more jobs than it created. We are 200 years down the road since the Luddite rebellion, and it hasn't happened yet. Each new technology has created more jobs than it robbed. Nevertheless, people like me for years have been saying it's going to be different this time. And it's going to be different this time because these are systems that we're developing with cognitive capabilities, not just manual capabilities. Now, when I would talk about this a few years ago, the backwardly looking economists would just dismiss this all out of hand. But I think, as many of you know now, this question of whether or not technology is going to take away more jobs than it creates, that's on everybody's mind, that has become a big issue. And the debate is out there as to whether that will happen or not, whether it will be how quickly it will happen, and also whether over the long run more jobs may be created. But I would say regardless of what happens over the long run, there are going to be periods when there's going to be vast devastation to jobs. Now, the two graphs you see up there, those are examples of what's been called the Great Decoupling. For decades, in all the developed countries, we saw a parallel growth between productivity and wage growth or job growth. And the Great Decoupling is that's no longer true. Productivity gains continue, even if at an anemic rate, while job growth is pretty much moribund, as is wage growth. So I would say this is already showing that there is downward pressure on job creation and there's downward pressure on wage growth. So in effect, we are already under technological unemployment. Now in Europe and elsewhere, you're talking about how shall we handle this? Is this really a technology problem? We're probably not going to ban the robots because we need the productivity gains. But then how are we going to ensure that people get their goods and services? And you're looking at guaranteed incomes, guaranteed basic incomes, and different ways of implementing that. But let's keep in mind that this is not just an income issue, it's also a meaning of life issue. Many people get their meaning from the work that they do. So are we creating a meaningful future for people? This is just one example of where we may not necessarily be creating a meaningful life for our grandchildren and even our children. Now, the last subject area I want to talk to you about is technologies that alter nature. And they come in many varieties. So we have nanotechnology, which is engineering on the nanoscale. So that means the scale of atoms and the scale of molecules. And that's even enlisting some quantum features of atoms for engineering purposes. So in a sense, we're transcending some of the limits of the physical aspects of nature. Another area that we're talking about altering nature is geoengineering. Now, we've already altered nature in so many different ways that it's hard to say whether the natural world even exists anymore, but one is in global warming. And geoengineering is specifically about technologies directed at mitigating the effects of geoengineering. One example of a technology like that would be just planting trees. That's a way of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. But one of the more dramatic examples is one where we seed the stratosphere with sulfate particles, in effect doing the equivalent of a volcano exploding, where we put an umbrella in the stratosphere of these particles and reflect at least half the sunlight away, or if not half the sunlight away. The computer models do show that we can slow down the rate of global warming by roughly 50% a year. Understand, that's not turning global warming around, it's just slowing down the rate of growth. But it doesn't actually solve the problem. On the other hand, it does give us a tool, and there may be demands for that tool if we don't succeed in other ways. The problem is we're tinkering with climate. And we have no idea what doing that year in and year out would do to the climate cycles. Or let's say whether there would be monsoons anymore in India, where they heavily depend upon the rainfall, if China tinkers with their climate in a particular way. So that's a real danger that we have to attend to. The last area I want to talk about is synthetic biology. So synthetic biology is largely about manipulating the genome or altering the genome in order to create new biological products or new species. And one area in which that's become really attractive is extinction technologies, where we can alter a species enough that that species will not carry a disease agent. So we have two different kinds of mosquitoes that carry disease agents. Some of them carry yellow fever and Zika, and others carry malaria. We can alter those. And we can introduce them. The chart is showing you what the normal transmission of a feature is from one generation to another. But we now have the technology, we can alter them where we can almost ensure that all the ancestors will have that new gene, that new configuration. So that's a very attractive use of this technology. The problem is we don't know how it will change the environment we introduce it into. Now, in the case of eradicating malaria, we may not care. That's a great benefit. But think about altering locusts so that they no longer swarm and destroy crops. Locusts swarm over such a large region of the earth that it covers 47 different countries. How many environments would we change? And now think about something that doesn't really have a grand societal benefit like that. It's just a frivolous new species that somebody engineered in the lab, and they released it, and it altered an environment in a way in which that environment died, or no longer, that ecosystem could no longer sustain other forms of life. So these are just some quick examples of some of the problems that we're dealing with. And now let me quickly talk to you about how, as we are reaping the benefits of emerging technologies, because let's be clear, they're all being developed because there are so many benefits, how we are going to mitigate the risks and undesirable societal consequences. We already have what is known as the pacing problem. The pacing problem refers to the fact that the existing governmental means we have for regulating technology is really totally out of sync with the speed at which technologies are being developed and deployed. And furthermore, there's so many technologies being developed, and there's so many ethical and societal considerations come into play, there's no way the legislatures can stay on top of the science or what's occurring. And furthermore, if they legislated, they would often legislate in ways that put in place laws, bureaucracies, and regulations that would not only interfere with development, but they would interfere with development in a manner that crystallized and left a lot of books and bureaucracies around when they were no longer needed. So we need some new form of governance. Now understand that I'm using the governance word, not just government. And when we use governance, we think about a broader array of mechanisms that we can use to oversee technology. So one set of mechanisms is known as soft law. And soft law refers to industry standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance policies, a whole array of mechanisms that we could put in place. The wonderful thing about soft law is it adapts, it's very agile, it can be changed as necessary. The weakness of soft law is that it seldom has an enforcement regime behind it. So this may be a concern for us. We may still need some hard law to enforce that the standards get followed. Or if industry violates those standards in a way that's harmful, we have a way of holding their feet to the fire. But another way in which we can solve some of our problem is through engineering and ethics. In ethics, we can reinforce certain ethical principles, such as that we do have a responsible agent for all technologies that are being deployed, that we don't allow that to be diluted. Another way of reinforcing ethics is by making certain ethical considerations part of the design code for the engineers. So when an engineer is working on a new technology, they don't just look at ensuring that certain components, like a servo, don't overheat, but they're also said in the design of this technology, you have to make sure that you are protecting privacy. And in the design of this technology, you have to make sure that if this technology fails, it's clear up front who's going to be responsible for that failure. In effect, who can be sued if that system fails. A third way that the engineers can get involved is moral machines, or machine ethics. And that's about implementing moral decision-making capacities, sensitivity to moral considerations into the technologies themselves so that they utilize them in the ways in which they make choices and the ways in which they make decisions. Now, that happens to be a book that happens to be a topic that I wrote a book on about 10 years ago with Colin Allen that more or less maps out what this territory is. And unfortunately, I'm not going to have more time here to talk about it. Now, if we talk about a new governance mechanism, there's all kinds of implementation challenges. And I'm not going to go through those, but those implementation challenges make it sound like this may be complex enough that it's never going to happen. Or it may make it sound like this is just really naive to think that you could put new mechanisms in place. In this case, a new mechanism is what we call global governance coordinating committees. Committees that would be multi-stakeholder forums, committees that would monitor the development of the field, flagging gaps, and if it found a gap that wasn't being attended to in another way, looking through this array of mechanisms for the best way to address it. And one of the primary projects that I'm working on right now is to do a pilot project of a global governance coordinating committee to convene a global congress for artificial intelligence. And I'm hopeful that that will happen within the next year or so. But rather than go into any of that in any more detail here, I'm just going to finish up and to say that if technology is speeding up as it appears to be, then it becomes incumbent upon us to move very quickly to act seriously about putting mechanisms in place for its oversight. So thank you very much.